All right, welcome back to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast. I am Patrick Martin, your host, teaching you mental health hacks for improving your thoughts, emotions, and behavior so you can do more than cope, but thrive. Today, I will be continuing the series on fundamental coping skills for depression. We are on step 10 of 12, so we're coming to the tail end of it. And just a reminder that these principles are adapted from the works of Dr. Jean Miranda and her cohorts from group CBT for depression. And today we'll be talking about relationships and how depression can interfere with relationships in the different facets and how we can try to get ahead of that and mitigate the fallout that comes from losses and barriers in that regard. Okay, but first I would just like to kind of check in with you. Everyone, I'm sure, has heightened stress at this time. We are well into the stay-at-home order at the time that I'm recording this. We are in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm feeling very blessed that I'm able to serve you in this capacity, that I'm able to work from home, focusing on the privilege of being with my wife and kids, and a lot of my thoughts are going out to you, my listeners, and my regular clients, my psychotherapy practice. I know it's a hard time, but as I'm talking about with all of my clients, trying to use this time to edify ourselves and find ways to hone in on our goals and use this as a time to evaluate what's important to us and try and come out of this with a better idea of some meaningful tasks and activities around personal growth that we want to really drill down into with the remainder of the year as things go back to this new normal. And none of us really knows what that looks like yet, but I'm confident that if we use this time to reflect and evaluate, that we'll come out stronger and more focused and intentional in the end. Okay, so just as a reminder, I am also looking to you to provide me with content ideas, because whatever I do on this end, I want it to be meaningful and actionable information for you so that you get the best use of your time in listening to this podcast. And so if there's anything you want me to speak to directly, please do let me know. You can use the contact form in the show notes, or you can shoot me a comment on the podcast as well, whatever works easiest for you. In addition to the podcast, it's my hope to curate YouTube tutorials and videos as well, and down the road also make online courses for you. So more targeted information based on your needs, and so I'd like to get your feedback in terms of what you would like from me. All right. So in this episode, I will be covering the following: relationship pitfalls, the impact of grief and loss on relationships, role fluctuations, and role disputes. Okay, so if you have not subscribed yet, please do hit the subscribe button. That way you don't miss out on any future content, okay? So let's get started.
Welcome to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast, where you will gain the knowledge to thrive. Here is your host, licensed psychotherapist, Patrick Martin.
All right, excellent. So the first thing I would like to touch on is the idea of relationship pitfalls. This is important with depression and quality of life in general, because the better we can improve upon our relationships and minimize the drama, the happier we'll be in general, because most of our happiness is predicated on the nature of our relationships, our level of satisfaction. So, despite what our comparative thoughts may tell us, even the most ideal relationships are not without their arguments, right? I think everybody can agree with that. There's no such thing as a stress-free relationship, right? I think over time we get better at getting ahead of the pitfalls within relationships, the things that we tend to be triggered in and with regarding the relationship, and pet peeves and discrepancies and boundary violations. But disagreements and arguments have three basic themes. And if we can learn to identify these themes, we'll get better at conflict resolution and avoiding conflict altogether. But not for the sake of avoidance, but because they just don't become as much of an issue. So if you're able to gain a better understanding of these themes, you'll be better equipped to mitigate the fallout when they do occur and focus your energies on protecting the relationship as opposed to just fighting about the fighting, right? And learning to be more effective at overcoming these barriers, it is crucial to know what the biggest hurdles are, so you know what to really target it. If your loved one is exhibiting symptoms of depression, you'll want to assess for the following culprits, okay? So if you're noticing that you're feeling depressed or your partner's feeling depressed, or you might suspect that some of their behavior is stemming from deeper rooted issues, so these are the things you want to look for: grief and loss, role fluctuations, and role disputes. So let me kind of lay that out for you. Okay. So regarding grief and loss, if you or your loved one may have experienced recent death, sickness, or separation, such as like divorce or breakup, that's worth noting. And it's important to ask yourself or your friend or partner, what typically happens when you experience these things? And how do you tend to cope? Like, what's your default coping mechanism or routine when grief and loss is on the table? All right. The next thing is role fluctuations. All right. So consider if your role in life has been taken around any form of change in response to triggers in your environment or context. So it's not uncommon to feel depressed as a result of change of status, because our sense of identity and our purpose is closely tied to the roles we assume in life, and may have strong reactions to new roles being forced on us, or feeling at a loss for a defined role in our lives. So when you think about role fluctuations, think about identity and your role as you see it in your life, whether that's on top of mind or even subconsciously. Oftentimes our roles change without our consent, and that's something to take note of. And the third is role disputes. So role disputes stem from one of three general areas: misunderstandings, unequal investments, or differing paradigms. And you might want to ask yourself, why are relationship disputes so impactful? It's because they have such a strong impact on other life domains and how we function in them in our other roles. Okay? So progress is made with intense focus, managing disagreements, which requires kind of a pause and reflection before we decide how we're going to react. And so now that you're a little better acquainted with these three pitfalls, I want you to take a closer look at each one and how we overcome these barriers. Okay, so we'll start with grief and loss. The first step in coping with grief and loss issues is to first acknowledge that it is normal and even healthy to experience sadness over the changes that result from the perceived loss. Because this change impacts your support system and your sense of security. We're all going through this COVID-19 crisis right now. This is going to go down in history as one of the biggest hurdles in society in terms of a shared loss. So we're talking loss of employment, loss of identity, loss of finances, loss of opportunity. And it's really, I think, rattling society at its core. But like I said in the before the intro, that I think if we can use this as an opportunity to really get in the habit of thinking outside the box, we're going to come out as more empowered individuals. And that's really at the core of how we deal with grief and loss, is how we create meaning out of a time of loss. That's a little tricky, but I'm going to walk you through it. Okay. So this kind of loss could be from the death of a spouse or a loved one, a divorce, a separation, or it could just be an adjustment, such as relocating and moving away from your support system. Depending on the circumstances, you will experience different ranges of emotions, okay, different intensity as well. And if you feel you've experienced a loss of some kind, now would be a really good time to write it out in specific terms, because the better we can define what the problem is, the more equipped we'll be to deal with it. All right, next I would have you consider how this loss or these losses have an impact on the way that you are interacting with your environment and with other people in general. Can you identify any changes in your other relationships since the loss? That would be typical. It usually has a ripple effect. As you learn methods for overcoming barriers to healthy relationships, you find that you become better adapted to coping with loss. Now consider your thoughts around the loss. Have your thoughts about yourself changed? Or I should say about the self, how you see yourself, your self-identity. Do you engage in any kind of shoulding or negative self-talk, such as, I should have done blank differently? Do you struggle with feelings of guilt? And lastly, I would have you reflect on your behavior since the loss. Has your behavior or routine changed since the loss? Have you stopped attending to your self-care or other healthy activities? Have you increased unhealthy activities as a means to cope? That would be typical as well. Things that don't really help you propel you forward or help you recover from the loss, but things that tend to keep us stuck. All right. Now, in terms of coping with grief and loss, I want you to understand that coping with loss does not translate into burying it, okay? It denotes the idea that you can have deep feelings and remorse over the loss without becoming depressed about it. It is the ability to acknowledge the loss without allowing it to define you at your core. And that's not easy. I don't mean that, flippantly. But it can be accomplished. And it can be accomplished by viewing the loss through the lens of CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And by exploring your relationships, thoughts, and emotions in response to an event, you can increase understanding and decrease blame, which lends to a state of acceptance. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so this brings us to the idea of leveraging relationships. So you can inquire from others how they have coped with loss in their lives. How have they managed to care for themselves and attend to their responsibilities in the face of grief? It's always good to turn to other people that we admire or aspire to be like and pick their brain about how they process things, because what we see on the surface is only the product of their investment and their internal work. So if we really want to understand how other people seemingly handle things better than we do, we really need to understand their thought process and kind of the interpersonal work they've done, the intrinsic work they've done within themselves, in order to respond the way they do. So if you can just kind of figure out what has worked for others and then experiment with their approach and see what works for you in your specific circumstance, because although it may have worked for them, it doesn't mean it will work for you. What works for me may not work for you, but we have to try on different hats until we find one that fits. But when we investigate from others what has worked for them, it gives us some pieces to start with, some things to experiment with. Okay? And once you've identified some contacts to consult with, I want you to write their names down. So, we're just brainstorming right now about people that you could potentially tap into to get feedback and information from, some actionable information. And just a little side note, grief and loss groups are a great place to get this kind of support. You can, something I often refer to in terms of finding grief and loss groups is griefshare.org. I often refer clients to that because it's super easy. You just jump on to griefshare.org, you punch in your zip code, and then you get a whole listing of local grief and loss groups in your area. They're generally free. I think there's like a $15 material fee for the book, registration fee, but oftentimes they'll waive that if it's a hardship. I know right now with COVID-19 going on, groups aren't a thing. But you may be able to find some online grief and loss groups. But when we do return back to normal, then I would encourage you, if you've had grief and loss, that maybe you check one of these groups out, and let me know how it goes. Okay, so that being said, perspective is everything. Okay, when it comes to grief and loss. And in the face of grief and loss, it is not easy to think of as perspective as a choice, but it is. And this is because we actively and naturally turn our minds to the things that are most significant to us. Our thoughts are directed toward the memories we are most attached to, for better or worse, whether we want to or not. And from a CBT perspective, we can use this to our advantage in times of loss, which better helps us cope with the unpleasant experience. And by this, I mean that we can focus on the death or loss we are experiencing as the most significant aspect of our experience, or we can choose to turn our mind toward the thing we appreciated about having participated in the life of the person prior to their death, which is both meaningful and of far greater prominence than the death or loss itself, only being a fraction of our experience with that person. And because it's human nature for our thoughts and our emotions to gravitate toward the experience of loss, also known as protest behavior, it requires some proactive effort in order to combat this automatic response. One helpful method is to write down or journal fond memories you shared about the person or things you appreciated about who they were. When I'm working with clients on grief and loss, I try and remind them that we do not own other people. They are not a possession, but rather we have the privilege, or had the privilege, of participating in the life of someone else. That person invited us to be a part of their life, and we invited them to be a part of our lives, and we had that shared experience. But by no means do we own that person. Not if you're married, not if they're your kids, not if they're your parents. but all we have is the privilege of participating in that person's life. And at the tail end of that, we get to reflect on that participation and that experience. The loss is just a minuscule fraction of our experience with that person. It's profound emotionally because of the attachment and the finality of it, but nonetheless, the challenge is to focus on the experience and the larger picture of our experience with that person. So you can create meaningful rituals on your own or on a personal scale to cope effectively at times of loss. You can do this, like I said, by writing a letter, and you could cast it into the ocean, or you could light candles, you could leave pictures at a resting place, whatever makes sense to you. But acceptance is always acquired through action of intention. Acceptance is not a passive activity. It's very proactive. Okay. All right. So this brings us on to role fluctuations. All right. We've been talking a lot about grief and loss in terms of death, but there can be grief and loss with role change, role fluctuations. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about now. See, loss is not always about death. Loss is often experienced in the form of role fluctuations, and if a loss is experienced over transition, we can find ourselves mourning the loss of purpose that the role provided in our lives, especially if that transition is not anticipated, if we're blindsided. And the more defined our roles are, the stronger our constitution is regarded in terms of our ego and our sense of agency, right? That's really impacted. And when our roles are changed of our own accord, we are keenly aware of what to expect with the transition, and although we might be sad over some of the anticipated loss that comes with that change of our role and our lifestyle and how we knew life to be, there's a clear benefit that we are focused on as the purpose of our transition, right? So when we are affecting the change intentionally, inflicting it on ourselves, there's usually because there's a benefit on the other side of that, of our own choosing. And as you learn techniques for overcoming these barriers, you'll become better at adapting to change, right? And we know that change is inevitable, right? It's a constant in life. And so the better we get at adapting to change, the better our outlook will be in general, right? Because of that, and that idea that we can be adequate, we can rise to the occasion, we can conquer the next challenge. It's that internal locus of control that, hey, I don't know what life is going to throw at me, but I know I can deal with it, right? All right, so some examples of self-imposed transitions are as follows. Leaving home to start college, leaving home to get married, going back to work after your children have grown, and leaving your current job or city for a promotion. Okay, and all of the examples that I just mentioned are generally perceived as positive transitions, things moving us closer to our goals and dreams. But even with that, there is a loss of the prior roles that we held, such as relationships with coworkers, the intimate support of parents when leaving the home, etc. And then there are role transitions that are imposed on us. Self-imposed transition is hard enough to cope with, but when the change is unexpected, it can cause an identity crisis. We can lose our sense of self and our sense of purpose, placing us at greater risk for depression. Some common examples of imposed transitions are loss of a job, divorce, injury, disability, and financial crisis, much like we are all experiencing right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. That is an imposed transition. And imposed transitions can leave us feeling stuck because we did not plan for the newly assumed role and are therefore ill-equipped to cope effectively. The person who loses their job may feel they can no longer identify themselves as a worker. The person who once prided themselves in their marriage can no longer identify themselves as a, quote, good spouse. Regardless of the type of role transition that we experience, be it self-imposed or unexpected, it is vital that you learn to define your experience in clear terms as soon as possible. Describe it and write it down. Okay, so you may have a lot of different feelings about the situation, and that's perfectly normal. Write down our feelings. You write down yours, I write down mine. It's a good practice for all of us so that we can later explore them. There's no right or wrong feelings. There's no right or wrong answer. And a side note, it is possible to experience dual role changes, meaning that we can experience multiple losses as a result of one loss. Because of the way our life domains are tethered together, we hold other roles, and those other held roles are intrinsically affected. For example, a divorce could change your identity as a spouse and a homeowner. It is important to acknowledge all of the losses as a result of a single role change. Okay, so coping with role transitions. Learning to manage role transitions is an important life skill because change is an ever-constant element in our lives. Change is not bad in and of itself. It is actually a crucial part of being happy. Change helps us maintain perspective, appreciate fragile nature of our existence, and makes dreaming and goal planning possible. It also fuels our creativity and our inspiration. The happiest people are the ones who learn to adapt effectively. The following considerations can help you adapt to change. Role strain. All of us hold more than one role at a given time, and sometimes these roles can compete for more attention than we have time for, energy, or resources to accommodate. If you are feeling depressed, tired, fatigued, or frustrated, it is sometimes an indicator that you're headed toward burnout because you cannot prioritize competing roles. Consider if your roles have defined boundaries, and if you feel you are committed to more than what one can reasonably attend to, and then consider what you can give up, or reprioritize, or delegate to release the stress. In light of your new role, what steps could you take to build a healthier quality of life, and what would be the ideal lifestyle given your new role? So, if you find yourself in a new space in life, what is the ideal of that space look like? What can you speak into your life in that new role to make it satisfactory? And what kind of support can you leverage in order to help you adapt to this new role? What kind of action can you take to get more support? And what is the nature of your thoughts around the role transition? If they are limiting or depressed thoughts, what primary concerns do they speak to? If they are unhelpful, how might you reframe your thoughts toward a healthier perspective? What are the actions you can implement immediately to better acclimate to the new role or change that has occurred? All right, you still with me? Because we are about to talk about relationships. And this, my friend, is probably the thorn in the side of people that have the most complaints. And we call this role disputes. All right, but relationship tends to be the stickiest area for all of us. So role disagreements are among the most common complaints with the quality of life issues that I see, especially related to depression. And role disputes are a salient stressor. They're found across all of your life domains, and they impact your home, your place of work, your intimate supports, your places of worship, and your friendships. As you learn effective coping skills for overcoming barriers to healthy relationships, you will become more proficient at managing conflict. And regardless of where these role disputes turn up, there are some basic skills for resolving them, which we will cover right now. Okay? Relationship conflicts have 3 points of intervention. Okay? Follow me here. The first is how we view the other person. The second is how we think about the problem. And the third is how we behave in response to the problem. First things first. Describe the conflict you are experiencing in as specific and concrete terms as possible, and then write them out. Second, consider if you are viewing the other person as a whole, not just the characteristics that you attribute to be associated with this person and this disagreement. Try to see the situation from his or her perspective. What valid points are they making, and what points are you contending, right? What are your objections? You can't attempt to see the situation from their viewpoint without necessarily agreeing with it. Can you identify a compromise and still find a way to get a benefit out of the resolve? That's important. And third, consider the manner in which you respond to distress. What is your behavioral default or your coping default? Now consider how you're responding to this particular dispute. Does your behavior change regarding this person from your default coping in general? If so, how? What is it about your dealings with this person that makes your response so unique, right? So if you're extra sensitive to one particular person or relationship, that's worth paying attention to. If you have stronger reactions. All right, so resolving disputes. This is the the bread and butter of it. This is the actionable information. So we know what the problem is. Maybe we've identified what the other person's role in the situation and our role in the situation is and how we're both contributing to the problem. So how do we fix it? All right. We can better resolve disputes by utilizing the skills learned from cognitive behavioral therapy, which is to seek understanding and not blame. All right. It's kind of what it boils down to. How do we seek understanding instead of getting caught up in the blame game? In the words of Jack Sparrow, the problem is not the problem. It is the way you are thinking about the problem that is the problem, right? Isolate the problem as a separate entity that the person tethered to on the other end of it. You can use intentional language to help you gain perspective. Examples include statements such as, I see the problem as ... or the common goal as I see it here is ... or we are both struggling because ... right? Language is uber important when we're talking about conflict resolution. You can brainstorm as well. So you can rattle off as many plausible resolutions as you can, but the clincher here is you do it without judgment, which are safe in their execution. So you encourage your counterpart to do the same, and after collecting some viable options, you consider which ones have the greatest potential for positive outcomes with practical implementation. Okay, so the key here is if you can brainstorm and they can brainstorm ideas without judgment or judging each other, and then you kind of put them side by side, and then you rate them jointly, and then whichever ones are highest, the most highly rated between the two of you, those are the ones you probably want to work on. Now, you could do this on a grid. If you have like 3 columns on a piece of paper, on the left side you could write plausible resolutions. In the middle you could put your appraisal, and then on the right column you could put your counterpart's appraisal, and just rate those ideas from 0 to 10. And that would be an easy way to kind of hone in on the ones that are going to most likely work, because you both have some belief in the resolution. And then you just select the resolutions that have the greatest value from the both of you. And then you repeat that until the resolve is made. Because not every solution is going to work, right? It's trial and error. Another side note, although many relationships can be improved and disagreements can be resolved through the implementation of CBT skills, if the relationship involves risk to your personal safety, attempting to resolve it is not the best course of action. If you feel like you're in danger or you're threatened by your partner, always seek personal safety by distancing yourself from the threat before anything else, and seek support. If you feel like you might be in a domestic violence situation, there is help. You can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. All right. So I know that was a lot of information. And that's because, when we start talking about things like grief and loss and relationships, we could go down the rabbit hole pretty deep. And we could go a lot deeper than this, but for the sake of simplicity and actionable information, I just wanted to lay this out for you in the clearest terms possible. So some key points are the things we covered in this episode. First, grief and loss is normal. It's a human experience, but you do not have to mourn in isolation. Seek support and cope through planning healthy activities. You can seek grief and loss groups through griefshare.org. Okay. Next, change is a constant in life, and when change occurs, so do our assumed roles. You can cope by seeking methods for creating meaning and purpose in your new roles, regardless if they are imposed or assumed. Next, a great skill to master in relationships is conflict resolution. If you can learn to seek problems and see them as a separate entity and not your own counterpart, the relationship in your life will be more positive. Okay? The problem is the problem. People are not the problem. No relationship is perfect and all good, right? And on the same note, all good relationships take work in learning to address the problems unique to them, but with a little effort and a strong foundation of good boundaries. And if you do this, you can become effective at overcoming boundaries and barriers to your healthy relationships. Okay. So how do you put this into practice? Here's a kind of a quick homework assignment for you. I would have you continue to track your mood, triggers, and coping using your own system scaling, or you can use the free tool I have up at the website, thementalhealthtoolbox.com. You can head over there and grab the free mood skill tracker. And then I would have you note the frequency of positive and negative interactions that you're having during the week. And then I would have you plan a healthy activity and that person that you will reach out to for participation. And third, I would have you pick one of the 3 relationship pitfalls we discussed to work on, which are either grief and loss, role fluctuations, or role disputes. Okay? And consider your points of intervention, the way that you interact with the person, the way that you are thinking about the relationship or the problem, and how you are acting in response to it, and what the change is that you want to see, and why that change is important to you, right? to be clear is to be kind, and the better you can define what the problem is and what you want, the better the quality of the relationship is going to be, and the more comfortable you get with this approach, the less conflict you will have, because you'll get ahead of it. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. Please, if you're not subscribed to this podcast and you find it useful, please do take some time to hit the subscribe button. That way you'll get all the episodes automatically downloaded. You won't have to hunt for them, and you'll be notified when new ones come out. Also, if you find this helpful, please do share. If you feel so inclined, rate the podcast, leave a comment, and carry on. If you find that you are feeling like you're in crisis, there is always help out there. There's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255, or you can text START to 741-741. Okay, so there's always resources out there for you. Just a disclaimer, yes, I am a licensed psychotherapist, but I am not your therapist. And if you need a professional, you should get one, okay? And you can do that by contacting NAMI or calling your local mental health clinics or county mental health. All right? So it's always a pleasure. I'm so excited to have you as my listeners. We have 2 more episodes to cover up wrap up step 11 and 12, and then we'll move on to some new topics, okay? Thank you so much for your time. You take care, and you have some new tools for your toolbox. So go make good things happen. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast. Learn more at www.thementalhealthtoolbox.com.